for Moscow, helping keep revenues flowing even as sanctions bite and war costs escalate. With sanctions straining budgets, energy output and defense spending, Russia's economy now faces pressure that could expose its limits. To talk about all of this, joining us now is a very special guest, Mr. Benjamin Hilgenstock, who is a senior economist at the Kiev School of Economics. His work focuses on international sanctions on Russia and their impact on the country's economy. He was previously an economist at the Institute of International Finance as well as an analyst with the IMF's research department. Thank you so much for taking out time and speaking to us. At the outset, I wanted to understand from you, now the Trump administration has just imposed significant sanctions on two of Moscow's largest crude companies. Is this actually hurting Moscow, or are they still finding ways around it?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to join the show. The answer to this question is not yet entirely clear. This is indeed the first time that the Trump administration has imposed meaningful sanctions on Russia, in this case on Rosneft and Lukoil. Mm-hmm. I think these measures have the potential to seriously hurt the Russian economy, to further create problems in the Russian budget. But to what extent they do that will need to be seen in the next coming weeks. There are still a couple of weeks of a transition period before these sanctions fully take effect. And then a lot depends on how the US government decides to enforce these measures.
I also wanted to understand how exactly has Russia managed to keep its economy afloat for this long? Is it smart adaptation or just unsustainable patchwork?
So it's definitely true that the sanctions regime has not been fully comprehensive. There are all sorts of loopholes of deliberate nature. There are all sorts of enforcement issues. But fundamentally, in 2023 and 2024, Russia benefited from the fact that it was transitioning basically to a war economy. The government is spending very large amounts of money on the war. Russian banks have lent a lot of money to the private sector, including companies in the military-industrial complex. This has kept wages rising even in real terms, and it has really boosted the economy over those 2 years. Mm-hmm. However, the situation in 2025 is very different. This growth model, driven by war-related fiscal stimulus, is really reaching its limits. Mm-hmm. The economy is on the verge of stagnation. The budget is in serious trouble, and these vulnerabilities could be exacerbated further with these new sanctions.
Indeed, and with the West now considering using frozen Russian assets for Ukraine's rebuilding, could that then set off financial risks for other countries as well? Does this set some sort of a precedent?
So we don't know exactly what is going to happen because the EU has not made a final decision. That is supposedly now planned to happen in mid-December at the next European Council meeting. What is being discussed is not confiscation, and therefore it avoids a lot of pitfalls that have been associated with confiscation of the Russian assets. For instance, with regard to the role of G7 currencies for the stability of European bond markets. What is being planned here with this reparations loan that is supposed to provide about 140 billion euros to Ukraine in additional funding for defense and potentially other matters. This is not confiscation and therefore should avoid these problems. And it does not really set any kind of precedent because it leaves Russia's claim on its assets basically unchanged.
I also wanted to understand from you how important then has India's discounted oil buying been to the survival of the Russian economy?
Very important. I think that is pretty clear. After the EU embargo on Russian oil took effect in late 2022 for crude oil and then in early 23 for petroleum products, Russia needed a new buyer. Chinese purchases of Russian oil have increased a little bit, but the key new player in this market is India. And this has, of course, allowed Russia to redirect its exports and to keep the export volumes going. And of course, over time, the discount on Russian oil has also narrowed. That means that Indian buyers are still getting Russian oil at somewhat cheaper prices, but not as much as in early 2023. And that means, of course, this is a critical lifeline for the Russian economy. I think, however, it's also fair to admit that this is kind of how the system is currently designed to operate. So sanctions coalition countries decided very clearly that they didn't want to reduce Russian oil volumes going to the global market to keep prices constant and rather manipulate prices via the price cap mechanism. And that, of course, requires someone to buy this oil. In India, buying Russian oil and then actually refining it and exporting some of these products to other markets is how the system was supposed to operate. Now, it hasn't worked perfectly well as intended, and that is, I think, why we're seeing maybe a shift in the approach now towards actually restricting flows of Russian oil to the market.
Indeed, and if Russia's revenues keep sliding, what pressure points will show first? Is it the budget, the military, or Russia's energy output?
I think it's clearly the budget. The budget is already in serious trouble this year. Russia's Ministry of Finance has revised the budget target already twice this year, and they're still going to miss the new target. And the situation is unlikely to get much better in 2026. A lot of this has to do with low global oil prices. It also has to do with the stalling Russian economy, which impacts all other revenues outside of oil and gas. And then, of course, expenditures are rising significantly because of the war. Now, I think the first thing we're going to see emerging is additional challenges to finance the budget. In my view, Russia will find a way to pay for the war, but it will get more and more painful to do so. So at some point, Russia's sovereign wealth fund is going to be used up. And then the only channel that remains is issuing of domestic debt, and the only buyer for that remaining is Russian banks. Of course, this is an authoritarian regime. This is a largely state-owned banking system, so banks can be forced to buy this debt, but that has ripple effects throughout the economy.
Indeed, and many analysts also say that sanctions have not really changed the behavior of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Do you think they've still achieved something strategically?
I think they achieved rather a lot. Vladimir Putin, let's be honest, is hell-bent on conducting this war, and he will continue to do so. He doesn't care about the Russian economy. He doesn't care about the Russian population. Considering all of that, there is ways for him to continue this. But sanctions have seriously constrained Russia's ability to pay for this war. They also have constrained Russia's ability to conduct this war on the battlefield in terms of access to high tech. And I think it's important to compare the current situation to a somewhat hypothetical scenario where no sanctions were enforced. That would mean there would be no restrictions on Russia's conduct of the war on the battlefield. Russia would have significantly more money available to pay for this war. Russia would have large amount of its international reserves not frozen, and thereby a lot more policy space for authorities to manage this war and the economy. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that sanctions have done a lot. Not enough, of course. The war is still going on in its fourth year, and there's some homework to be done in Europe with regard to continued imports of Russian oil and gas. There's some work to be done with regard to Russian exports of oil and gas to other countries, including India. But that doesn't mean that sanctions haven't had an impact. So.
Indeed, and looking ahead to 2026, what's the one move that Western policymakers could take that would genuinely hurt the Russian economy?
I think a lot of the sanctions that are being discussed and adopted hurt Russia on the margins. It costs an additional billion, 2 billion, whatever in export earnings. It costs additional money for imports of war critical goods, but it doesn't fundamentally change the calculus of the regime. And Putin still seems to think that the longer this goes on, the better the situation is going to get for him. And I think you can see this pretty clearly whenever the Russians show up at some kind of negotiation in Alaska or elsewhere. They come with the same grotesque maximalist demands. So nothing has changed there. The one thing that can fundamentally change the situation is further sanctions on Russian energy exports, and specifically reducing the volume of Russian oil and gas going to the global market. This would fundamentally undermine macroeconomic stability because export earnings would drop significantly, and it would exacerbate the budgetary crisis and put more pressure on the entire system.
Indeed, with that, I would like to thank you, Mr. Benjamin Hilgenstock, for taking out time, of course, speaking to us on the focal length and sharing your analysis.